But it wasn't 3 hours later when I was getting in my car to drive to work that I got an urgent phone call that the blimp was about to crash. And it was rush hour. It was Pennsylvania. I-95 was in its path. I was like, oh, Jesus Christ.
What's going on, Mel?
What's up?
What's up?
I have good news.
You have good news.
I
like
really
good news.
do. I do. Starting next week, it sunsets at 5 p.m.
Oh my gosh. I'm telling you, during the winter nuts.
The winter nuts? What?
What is on my mind? During the winter nuts with my sweaty balls. During the winter months, I become a bear. I am just like, oh, it's 7 o'clock. I'm gonna get in my jams. It is not good.
Listen, same. It has been getting dark at around November-ish, December. It starts getting dark at 3 p.m.
It's
And I'm just like,
unacceptable.
is it 11?
Yeah.
I have my slippers on. Oh my gosh. Well, we were incredibly lucky to sit down with Anne-Marie Squeo today, who is an expert in crisis communications. She is the CEO and founder of Proofpoint Communications. She's a strategic branding, communications, and crisis PR maven. She's also a Pulitzer-winning business journalist. And 2 words to describe her: battle proven. What did you take away from this conversation?
I love crisis communications. I think it's just a fascinating topic about how companies and how people respond to crisis. And there was a lot that Anne-Marie shared that looked really under the hood around how this all works within organizations, how decisions are made, and honestly, what good looks like that I did not know. And I think is really, really eye-opening for anybody listening. What did you think, Mel?
Absolutely agree. If you're a leader in an organization, you're going to find this episode extremely useful and helpful. She gave some pretty clear tips on this is how you show up and this is how you pull through and come together. So with that, here's Anne-Marie. Well, Anne-Marie, we are so excited to have you join us today on Your Work Friends. And I'm going to jump right in with a headline that came out from Axios, and I want to get your thoughts. They said CEOs are enjoying a hot speech winter, one where speaking out in outrageous ways carries no cost. And we know recently we saw the United Healthcare CEO not really dealing well with critical crisis, and Mark Zuckerberg's comments on the Joe Rogan podcast and how that's impacting Meta. What are your thoughts on that statement?
There's always a cost. The question is how you're measuring it. We'll go back to United Healthcare. I mean, I think Zuck's comments are frankly just bizarre, and I keep wondering what his wife thinks. But a lot of my friends have gone off Threads, they've gone off Instagram and closed their Facebook accounts. There's a critical piece to this in terms of has no cost, right? One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is, when Jeff Bezos pisses us all off and, we're like, I'm not using Amazon anymore. I'm not. And I tried this, actually. I tried this for a couple of months last year, and it's really hard. So if you're addicted to the product or service, and you have been for the last 5 years, then it's probably unlikely you're going to get unaddicted. But if it's more marginal in your existence, so the Washington Post subscription, that is like the 8th thing I read any day, I can live without that, right? So, I mean, I think that it's going to be hard for CEOs to say there's no cost, because for some, it might appear that way because their product or service is so essential to our lives that most of us can't imagine we'd be punishing ourselves if we cut it off. But if you don't fall in that category, and most people don't, then there are going to be repercussions for doing things that piss off 50% or more of your customers, subscribers, whatever.
Yeah. I think Francesca and I were talking about this before the session, and one of the things we both agreed on was there's maybe 5 people, I think, Francesca, you said, who have FU money to be able to not have a cost to their statements.
Yeah, I mean, again, most CEOs, I think, measure the cost financially, but bad reputations have bad financial implications, and they might not happen immediately. But one thing that I think that is a midterm kind of outcome of, say, Meta's CEO's comments is you're already seeing Blue Sky and all these competitors come up, and they're going to get better. Just like Threads stepped in to pick up where Twitter X left off, someone's going to step in and pick up where both of those guys left off and run away with it. And the eyeballs and the advertising money. Don't count too soon. I wouldn't count my chickens before they're hatched, because it might not be that the next 3 months are impacted, but the next 12 months may well be as alternatives come to bear.
It's so fun to watch. I imagine in your area, someone's always in crisis. And to your very good point, you started this by saying, going through the Trump administration, every organization is going to be in crisis because of all the change that's going on. And I'm curious about, how do you define either like a PR crisis or crisis communications? For those that don't know about this topic, what is it?
Oh, this is a great question, because, I've definitely worked places where the CEO or senior leaders thought everything was a crisis.
Yeah.
So if we're not included in a story, it's a crisis. And if we are included in a negative story, it's a crisis. And, I think that all of us in the industry have to kind of set a barometer for what actually requires a crisis response. And that's an important conversation and level setting that needs to happen in every organization, because if you, the communications team, are not aligned or at least educating your leaders about what makes the cut for when we're going into crisis mode, you will spend your entire day and night and weekends fighting fires that are not important, and you'll never get to the good stuff and the important stuff. So I think if it's a real crisis, Francesca, I think it's got real reputational and financial implications for a company and business implications. So you are a railroad company and your railroad went off the tracks in Ohio and potentially poisoned an entire community with toxic things that came out of the cars. You've got a crisis.
Yes.
And it's going to potentially result in regulatory repercussions, government punitive repercussions, lawsuits, environmental related issues, right? So that is a legitimate crisis. I would say things that no one's going to be talking about in 24, 48 hours, not a crisis. So I think by definition, a crisis is going to be longer than 48 hours. You may feel like it's a crisis in the moment, but if it's going away and no one's going to remember it in a year, it wasn't a crisis.
Yeah, I'm curious about that timing, right? I mean, within 48 hours, if no one's going to be talking about it, it's not a crisis. I'm curious on the other aspect of that, because especially with social media, the first 24 hours of a crisis, or that after something happens, the train derails and spills chemicals. The LA wildfires are happening. United Healthcare CEO gets shot. The BP oil spill. That first 24 hours seems like it's so critical. And then especially with social media, the speed of which information gets put out into the ether. How important is the first 24 hours? If you've identified that this is in fact a crisis, how important is that first 24 hours as an organization?
It's very important to establish trust and confidence in whatever comes next. I think the challenge of the first 24 hours in some of these situations is you don't really know a lot in that first 24 hours, right? Whether it's an oil spill, a plane crash, a derailment, a cyber attack. I mean, there's some stuff but there's so very much that you do not know and you won't know for a while. But you have to establish the kind of connected tissue that you're going to need in this situation, and whether you're going to be viewed as someone who's withholding information or going to be forthcoming when you can be. And the challenge, of course, in social media, things tend to move much more quickly. Like years ago, right? Like, we didn't know when there was a crisis until the news came out the next day. So, you guys might be too young to remember that. But now everything's like people might know about it on social media before even the company is aware that something happened. So it creates both benefits and detriments in any crisis situation, because on the pro side, you can use social media to find out. So you can be listening all the time. And so if people start talking about something, you know about it before it becomes a wildfire. And you can disseminate information more broadly, more quickly because of it. But so can and misinformation get disseminated more quickly. And now you don't just have a crisis of the underlying event. You have a crisis that you're trying to contain information that's actually inaccurate about the underlying event. And so it has definitely made the job of a communications team, a crisis PR team, and a leadership team exponentially harder, because you've got all these moving pieces and you can't afford to wait. And yet you can't afford to be too detailed either, because you might be issuing a detail in the first, make it up, 10 hours, turns out not to be true. And now you've got to go back and correct. Now you started to break trust, right? And we started with, first, we want to establish that we are going to be a trustworthy communicator in this situation. The wildfires are sort of an interesting example where I've got a lot of friends who live in LA. Many have been evacuated. Luckily, nobody's lost their home yet that I know of. But every single one of them said the communications have been god awful. And you saw it in some of these press interviews that they were doing, where fire chief was dissing the mayor and the mayor didn't know, and she's smiling. Meanwhile, people's homes are burning down. And I'm thinking, well, I wouldn't trust this crowd at all, especially if my life and my family's life was in danger. So that's really that first 24 hours. I think we all recognize you might not know enough, but you've got to establish that I'm going to be a trusted partner with you in this endeavor. That feeling is something that's either going to help long term in managing this crisis, or it's going to hurt you long term in attempting to manage the crisis. So that getting the right spokesperson out there, having a transparent and trustworthy demeanor, not hiding facts that are easily known from multiple sources, but you're not willing to confirm it. There's so many little things that end up adding up to that. How do people feel about us right now? And, I think that's one of the key thing in the first day of any major crisis.
So much of this comes out to planning. You had mentioned too earlier on, one of the things you want to do is establish what is a crisis, which I think is super important. So you're not chasing down the fact that you didn't get into Fast Company this month, right? Like that's not a crisis.
And yet,
Dora flying out of a Boeing Max, right? That's a crisis.
that's a crisis, yeah. Unless of course you're Apple, in which case it was like a great sales point because the phone dropped miles and still was working.
Oh, that's hilarious. It's so funny. I live in Portland, Oregon. The door of that the Boeing Max landed in one of my neighbor's yards over yonder. So it was like a big, like, oh, he found the door. I'm like, that is not what you want as a company. I'd love to open up the HUD a little bit on who's behind these organizations. Like, what's the command center look like for crisis communications? Who is determining what's a crisis? Who is determining at these organizations how to even respond, or who's going to be the spokesperson? What does that typically look like?
And it varies, right? It varies depending on the crisis, the company, and the people. So if you've got, let's say you're a big company and you have a crisis, then, you undoubtedly have a senior comms person, a chief communications officer, a VP of communications who's going to be point, in theory, on that, if you let them. Not every CEO will let them. And they often want to put their voice and their reaction into the situation, and it can make it much harder to get to where you might need to be. if that's the case. But your command center, it's going to change depending on what the crisis is. So the two constants that I have seen in every crisis is comms and legal. Well, we're always there. Now, if it's a product thing, right? Like if it's an airplane crash, the head of the Boeing commercial airplanes business is going to be involved. Probably the engineering folks and manufacturing folks are going to be involved. Legal is definitely involved. Comms is involved. Leadership is involved. But comms and legal are almost in every single crisis. If it's an employee event, somebody was killed in the workplace and it's because of whatever reason, HR is going to be involved, right? It's a cyber attack. Then your information security and your technology officer are going to be involved. So it's going to change depending on the crisis, but always should have communications and legal at the table looking at that, working in lockstep. And it's wonderful when that happens.
Yeah. Especially because your comms people, that is their craft. That is their skill. And I think especially when you're the CEO, or even if you're head of product or head of engineering, I think sometimes there might be too much of an emotional bias on some of those things if you're coming in. I don't know if you've seen that or not.
I think you do see this, right? I mean, because, well, let's face it, a crisis is only a crisis because something didn't work, right? Something went wrong. Someone was killed, a railroad went off the tracks, we were breached in a cyber attack, or a customer was breached in a cyber attack. So something didn't work, right? It's never a crisis when everything's going well. So that's just going to ratchet up everybody's emotions. From a communication standpoint, it's important to understand that, because we're not actually going to be able to appropriately address this crisis if we don't understand where everyone's coming from so that we can get them where we need to go. And so it could take a little while. And that's the challenge, of course, is that in most crises, time is of the essence. And yet you've got to somehow get people on this path with you so you could do the right thing instead of doing nothing, which is often most people's default position, which is let's just say nothing. Or let's just say the bare minimum and leave it at that, right? One of the things that I thought was interesting, Boeing had 2 plane crashes within a year and a half or so, and their statements were overly lawyered and ice cold.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody uniformly looked at those statements and were like, really? 346 people are dead in these 2 plane crashes, and you're like basically thoughts and prayers. And yet, there's a lot you don't know when you have to put that statement out. Could it have been pilot error? Maybe it's not the airplane's fault. You don't want to overdo it, but you can't come across as being almost uncaring when people's lives were ended and many families globally were impacted by those 2 events.
It's interesting when you can feel where it's overly lawyered or sometimes it's overly emotional. The one I always remember from grad school is during the BP oil spill, and the CEO made it all about himself. Like, well, no one's suffering as much as I am. And everyone's like, you need to go away, right? Like, this is not about you. But it sounds
right. Didn't his weekend plans get ruined or
yes,
something?
yes. And you're like, I'm sorry, the Gulf of Mexico is completely under crude oil right now. But it seems like comms really is that, for lack of a better term, almost like the adult in the room that's helping you strike the right balance for whatever the situation calls for.
You have to be the truth sayer in the room. Like, you have got to be the one who walks in the room and just says it. And it doesn't always make you very popular to do that. When I was at Xerox and I was the chief brand and comms officer, the pandemic hit. And, the week before everyone was told to send their employees home, we had already sent our employees in Italy home. Because remember, Italy was an early hotspot.
Oh, yeah.
And I went to the CEO and said, we need to send everybody home. And he was like, are you nuts? And I was like, no. I mean, have you not paid attention to the news? So we had a whole meeting and nobody else agreed with me. And the next day I had to go back to him. And I was like, so can we talk about sending everybody home? And he's like, I thought we had a meeting about it yesterday. And I'm like, well, we did, but we came to the wrong answer. So let's have that conversation again. And so he said, okay, you got 5 minutes, go. And I did, and he sent everybody home. And he told employees in an all employee phone call, like, you guys have Anne-Marie to thank for me actually getting ahead of this issue. And the way he got ahead of the issue was me saying, like, here's the thing. We don't even know what the deal is with this thing. All we know is it's very transmissible from human to human. You are going to send everybody home. So the question is, do you want to send them home today and get ahead of being ordered to send everybody home and be perceived as a good leader? Or do you want to wait until the government tells you to send everybody home and just do it with them? Either way, you're doing it. So you just have to decide when you want to do it, and wanted to do it ahead of time. So great. We sent everybody home, and then the order came 48, 72 hours later. He got a lot of credit from our employees.
Yeah, it's goodwill. That's goodwill, man.
And
this guy cares about his people.
You should have just taken the credit. That's my job, is to give you credit. And he was like, no, people should know how that went down. So for communicators, it requires a level of courage for any leader, but especially for a communicator, because we're probably the only ones in the room with no direct relationship to the cause of the event. We are probably the most objective person in the room in a crisis. We have to stand strong and ask the questions and be unemotional and super calm and not accusatory, and just try to get people moving in the right direction.
When you think of essential elements that communications teams, or even if you're a leader, right? What's a playbook to have in place to help you contain the crisis when stuff pops up? What are the key elements you would include in that?
Yeah, it's funny. Playbooks are a thing. There are whole firms that will come in and build you a crisis playbook. I always think that's a hilarious notion.
Seems like it would be situation to situation, right? It depends.
Right. You can't possibly be prepared for every possible. I mean, now listen, if you run a rail company, you can be prepared for a derailment, right?
Yeah.
You got that. The same thing with an airplane crash. But for the most part, there's going to be stuff that happens that you never thought you were going to be involved with. So I'm not a big believer in playbooks. In fact, at one company I worked at, I arrived my first week, somebody came over and handed me like this 3/4 of an inch thick crisis playbook. And I was like, really? And I put it in the drawer, and I never, ever looked at it. And this was a company that had many crises during my tenure there, but we never once related to the book. And I'll tell you, no CEO has ever asked me, what does the playbook say about how to handle this crisis?
Let's go through our manual.
It says if an employee dies. So I am just a big believer in all the pre-work that makes it possible to successfully manage a crisis. So hire really good people with diverse experiences who may have handled various crises in different companies or at agencies or whatnot, and then let them tackle the problems when they start happening. Establish authority and trust with the leadership team, because it actually doesn't matter if you're in charge and you have a playbook. If the CEO doesn't trust you, you are not going to be able to influence the outcome of this crisis. Define what a crisis is. Who needs to sign off on the actions related to that crisis? I'm just a really big believer in hire people with good judgment, great experience, different experience, and make sure that everything that you're doing up to the point of the crisis ensures that you have the authority and the trust and the seat at the table to influence and drive that discussion and that outcome, because otherwise you're just going to take them along for the ride. Don't be a passenger on this bus. Drive this bus. We're really the only ones, as I said, that are sort of objective in this situation and have that external sensibility to understand what's happening outside the business, so that we can bring that to whatever solution and communication strategy we're developing.
I think you make the best point is that the communications team is probably the most neutral party in any room when they're dealing with something like this. You just bring a different point of view that and it takes out the emotions completely from it, which is needed. How do you manage those emotions up front if you're a comms person?
Listen and empathize with that person, because often all that person really needs is to emote. Like, they need to get all that they're feeling out there, and they're probably going to get to the right place. But if they don't have the space to do that, you're going to be bouncing up against it when you're trying to get them someplace else. So I do think that despite the fact that we are communicators because we are, in theory, better at communicating, I think this is one of those very important situations where it's better to just listen to people and let them go through it. If it's 20 minutes, an hour, whatever, because they're probably going to talk themselves to exactly where you need them to be or close to it. And then understand that those emotions are real. If you're a CEO and say, like, you're in a precarious position, your company's not financially performing that well, there have been, major recalls or something on your product and other things, and now a crisis hits, you're scared. Like, that's your number one response is, even if you're not articulating it, there's like a knot in your stomach. Like, is this the thing that's going to push me out the door? What you need is a comms person who understands that's your starting point. But here's where we need to go. And actually, if we manage this crisis really well, it will elevate your standing instead of being the nail in your coffin.
That makes sense. One of the things that we talk about often is transparency and how transparent you can be, because we're always up against general counsel and their feedback as well around what you can and can't say. How do you balance transparency with the legal constraints that come up during a crisis?
I mean, the thing is, you don't want to build trust between the comms and legal team in the middle of a crisis, right? Because if it's not there, trust me, it's not coming that week. So that's a relationship that is so absolutely essential. That comms legal relationship. I have never had a general counsel. Well, actually once I had a general counsel, and it was painful not to have that trusted relationship. But in every other role, we were like attached at the hip. Because we understood there was going to be so many touch points where we were going to have to come to mutually agreeable decisions that we had to be on the same wavelength and deeply invested in that. That gets back to what I'm talking about. Hire people who have the skills, who have the judgment, and who can build the relationships that are going to allow you to influence the solutions, move quickly, and do it with trust, because you can't build it in the middle of a crisis.
So say someone's day one on a new job, they're the new comms leader. How do they quickly, because you have to get that buy-in between multiple departments as soon as a crisis comes up, how do they quickly gain that trust from business leadership, from those department leads? What's the best way for them to build trust quickly?
I guess not screw it up, but actually had this happen to me.
Don't screw
it up.
I did have this happen to me. It was my first week at Lockheed Martin, and a major military program. So I was on like day 2 or 3. A major military program. The Pentagon had changed the acquisition strategy and thrown everything into flux. And I remember standing in the middle of my office thinking, oh, Jesus, what are we doing now? And I just like gathered all the people who needed to be in the room on this, even though I was the new person. I was like, okay, we have a crisis. We need to come up with a media statement, a media plan, at least for 24 hours. And then we can regroup tomorrow. Because this was at like 4:00 in the afternoon. I pulled everybody together. We figured it out. We moved out the statement, and it worked fine. And then the next day we got to work as a larger group on a plan. If you're new, like, you're going to need to pull in the people who are there and use your best judgment. This is where the judgment piece comes in, because judgment isn't something that like appears. You can't go to Walmart and pick it up off a store shelf.
Yeah, agreed. Well, I think it's one, kudos to you, because holy cow, day 3. That's a big
Ridiculous.
thing to do.
In fact, my email, they had misspelled my email. So my actual email at the company still wasn't working. So I was having to call people and be like, can you just come to my office? Because I can't email you. And we just had to move quickly. I actually love those.
What do you think?
They're fun.
Do I can see you easily doing fine under pressure. What do you think was your secret sauce in that moment, though? How did you get everyone to go
Just
along with what you?
staying calm. I had written about the defense industry as a reporter. I had worked at a different defense company. I understood the subject. I understood like what we were dealing with. And so I could move really quickly. If I hadn't, I think at the end of the day, most of us know what the right thing is to do in the moment. And the harder part, as we've been talking about, is getting other people there. And so in this case, I guess I got a more latitude than somebody who was totally green would have gotten because I was a known entity and people trusted me, right? Otherwise, that trust would have to be developed over time.
Yeah, like so trust truly is the secret sauce for it to be
I think
effective.
it is. I think it is.
Yeah.
Right?
I'm very curious about one of the most unexpected crisis scenarios that you managed through. You don't have to name names, but is there any that comes to mind where you're like, that was unexpected?
Yeah, actually, a blimp.
A blimp?
Blimp?
Right.
Like the Goodyear blimp. Like the Goodyear blimp.
When I was at Lockheed, we had this prototype airship. It's called the Hail D. And we all got up at 3:30 a.m. to watch this massive, it was like, I think 5 football fields long airship take off from a dock in Akron, Ohio. It was beautiful, dawn, lovely. But it wasn't 3 hours later when I was getting in my car to drive to work that I got an urgent phone call that the blimp was about to crash. And it was rush hour. It was Pennsylvania. I-95 was in its path. I was like, oh, Jesus Christ. So that was definitely a crisis. I mean, again, we had a plan for what would happen if we had issues with it, but it really looked like it was going to be a flawless test, and it did not. It was not a flawless test. And it ended up coming down in a wooded area, very close to a beaver dam in Pennsylvania. The good news was we immediately dispatched a communicator to the beaver dam to answer all the local news press questions. So we basically, it wasn't like a national news story, but certainly in the Philadelphia, Ohio, Pennsylvania area, it was a couple of days of coverage of this massive airship that went down. And working again, it took 10 minutes to get to the office. By the time I got into the office, we had all the necessary people on the phone. I'm like, where's the airship? Like, it was just like drilling the questions. Like, okay, I've dispatched this person. Let's get this information written up, get it into that person's hands. They need to be on site. Reporters are going to come to the location, blah, 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 work with the local authorities. We were seamless. Like I had everybody on an open line in my office for like 3 hours. I was like, just come back and talk on the squawk box. I'm leaving the line open. Like, and so that's, this is the stuff that happens in the middle of a crisis. You just have to stop doing everything else and just do this.
Well, which it begs the point of not having a playbook, because I don't know if you're working at Lockheed Martin, you probably don't think you're going to have to deal with the National Beaver Society because the blimp crashed in their dam. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, but now here you are.
The ASPCA has got you on a speed dial.
Yeah. I can't imagine.
Right? Like, you cannot plan for every possible crisis. Trying to hurt the beavers.
No. No beaver was killed.
No beaver was hurt in the testing of this airship.
Yeah. How do you know if a crisis response was successful? What do you measure?
Nowadays, with social media, there are all kinds of tools that you can listen to how people are talking, right? So there's the qualitative and then the quantitative. On the qualitative side, if people are pissed off, right? You mentioned United Healthcare earlier, and I actually would love to go back to that. But it was pretty remarkable that a man was murdered and people were talking about how hot the assassin was and how, the company kind of deserved it. That's not their fault. Well, that wasn't their fault, but that doesn't change the fact that you can be measuring qualitatively how people are feeling about your company when they're cheering for the murderer instead of being completely outraged about what happened. And I would just say one thing. I actually think that United Healthcare is doing a very good job with this. So, yesterday was their earnings, and their CEO of the parent company, United Health, talked about what's wrong with the healthcare system. And he also had an editorial in the New York Times a week or two after the murder happened that addressed it. Now, it does beg the question, as the nation's largest insurance company, what are you doing to solve the problem? Right? Like, so great that you're now acknowledging that there is a problem, but what are you doing to solve it? Which I hope is the next piece for them. But I've seen them lean into this in a manner that I think is better than some companies do in these situations.
I have a quick question, follow up for that, because with United Healthcare, what I found interesting just as an observer and someone consuming, they're getting out at front about acknowledging their role, but then their actions seem to not align with their acknowledgement. So, for example, like an article came out yesterday about how they're one of the few insurance companies who are increasing, I think it was cancer medication, by over 1,000% compared to other insurers, making it more expensive for their customers. So, when you see the CEO coming out and like they're acknowledging it, but then the actions of the organization, does it defeat the crisis communication effort when then the organization continues to make conflicting decisions or actions?
Yes. And that's why I agree with you. I think that they've leaned into this. We're partly responsible for the state of the healthcare system, but they haven't taken it to what should be the next level. As the nation's largest insurer, here are the things we're going to do differently.
Right.
And boom, 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 right? And hopefully, fingers crossed, that's their next piece. Because otherwise, in a couple of months, this, yes, it's broken and we're really sorry and we have to all do better, is not going to play well with the vast majority of the public, because they're going to be like, yeah, we heard that from you for 6 months now and you haven't done anything different.
It's the new thoughts and prayers.
Right. So
Yeah.
I do think that is always the challenge, right? Even if your crisis communications response is great, Boeing had the same issue. Their issue was the problem with the manufacturing of these planes that has come out and now gotten a lot of media coverage and government intervention and other things, right? I often would say, like, it's comms' job to like prepare the garden, fertilize the soil, make sure that it's an environment in which things can grow. But if things don't grow here, that's not my fault. Like, that's your fault.
Can you tell a lot about a company's culture by how they respond in a crisis?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, because that response isn't coming out of nowhere.
Right.
And
Yeah.
if it does come out of nowhere, then it probably won't be trusted. Think about the insurance industry right now and these fires. I mean, it's not a good scene. And they had already cut off people's insurance policies. And I've lived in California. Insurance was extraordinarily expensive to get, and that was when you could even get it. Now you can't even get it in many places. And I wasn't in a fire zone. But at this point, you don't even really know what a fire zone is. It could be anywhere. So I think that the way in which these companies have approached their business will make them inherently trustworthy in this situation because of everything that led up to it. Now, maybe somebody will step out and do the right thing. Do the right thing has multiple implications, because at the end of the day, many of these are publicly traded companies, and, they're mining their portfolio for risk, and they only want to have a risk exposure of, make it up, 30%, 40%. So that means we can't cover any of these folks unless they pay this much more money. And that makes it prohibitively expensive, and most people can't afford that. And so again, we get down to sort of a situation where, okay, if you're part of the problem, you're also part of the solution. So are you going to lead on this and try to figure out how we might be able to at least address this? So I saw on the news last night, people are hanging signs with QR codes to their GoFundMe pages in the front of their burnt houses in Pacific Palisades, so that people driving by can just get to their QR code and give them money. That's terrible. In this country, with the kind of money this country has, that anyone should have to have a GoFundMe page, especially if they had insurance.
Agreed.
You mentioned that almost every company is going to be in crisis this year. I feel like the insurance companies are like,
they're in the hot seat.
Buckle up.
Yeah.
that kid is going on trial. That man is going on trial for shooting the United Healthcare CEO. And so will the healthcare industry, insurance industry, be on trial. Because that is going to be part of that entire trial. There's 2 trials right now. And if they got combined, or maybe even 3 if they bring federal charges, they'll get combined into one trial. But make no mistake, he will be on trial, and so will the healthcare insurance industry.
I'd love to talk about advice that you personally might give to folks who are in a crisis, dealing with crisis, just based on your own experience. What's your go-to stress reliever? What do you do when you're in an active crisis situation?
Oof. Well, after the work, I would definitely have a glass of red wine. During it, I think it's really important to just try to stay calm and clear. And whatever you need to do, that is important. Exercise or meditate or whatever it is for you, like being very calm and almost impersonal about the situation is really important when everyone else is flipping out.
So that's from a communications standpoint. If you're a leader, in one word, what's the most important quality a leader needs?
Judgment. No question. Judgment.
What is the best piece of crisis management advice that you've ever been given?
Don't be afraid to ask the hard questions. Often what happens in a crisis is not only are people afraid to ask the hard question, they're afraid to ask the follow-up to the hard question. But if you don't know everything that you need to know, your crisis is going to mushroom, right? And you could have gotten ahead of it if you had just kept going down that line of questioning to get, what else do I need to know that we're not doing, right? So I can respond, because there's going to be a reporter calling me about this in less than 36 hours. So tell me everything now so I can get ready for it. So I think ask the hard questions and ask the hard follow-up questions.
Almost like an attorney, like, I don't want any surprises here, kind of thing.
Yeah. That the worst thing that any business can have is a surprise.
Okay. What's one crisis communication myth that you would like to debunk?
You don't need a playbook. You need courage, commitment, and clarity. But you do not need a playbook.
All right, Anne-Marie, we like to get to know our guests on a more personal level. So I'm going to ask you some rapid round questions that are just light and easy. We just want to get to know you. Are you down?
Okay, let's do it.
Right. All right. It's 2030. What do you think work is going to look like?
Well, I'm really hoping that the AI is doing all the mundane things and that we're down to a 3-day work week.
Yeah. I like the world.
We're here for
You're
it.
painting. Yes.
Totally.
Yeah. What music are you listening to right now?
I listen to such a bizarre blend of music. What was playing in my car just today? I was listening to a little John Legend a little while ago.
Nice. All right. Do you know he started as a management consultant? I read that.
Isn't that wild?
Yeah. Listen.
Bain or BCG.
It was one of the MBBs. I thought. I know Mel and I come from Deloitte, and everyone's always trying to. Oh no, it was Deloitte. I'm like, it was not Deloitte. It was not Deloitte. We like to claim everything. What are you reading?
I am reading Mel Robbins' Let Them Theory.
What do you think?
It is a great way to start the year.
Nice. That's a tough one. Like that whole idea. I think that would be
tough, right. And I was actually having a little mini meltdown about something last week, and I was complaining to my husband, and he was like, "Well, honey, what about let them? Let them." I was like, "Oh my God, yes, right. Let them. Perfect."
Was it freeing?
Well timed.
Yeah. Who do you really admire?
I really admire Michelle Obama. I think that she is authentic. I think she has demonstrated really good judgment, and I think she lives her values. She's not afraid to live them. And I think that's like one of the most important things we can do, especially as women, and stop trying to contort ourselves into what everyone wants us to be and be who we want to be.
Recently, someone on social media said that they're going to RSVP as Michelle Obama going forward when they say no to things, and she's not showing up to anything anymore.
Yeah, and there's been all these great memes of her just like something like,
no, thank you.
Yeah. No, and I also love the fact that I don't need to give you a reason.
No explanation needed.
And that actually is something that I have been over the last couple of years trying to break the habit of, right? Like I always feel like, well, what are you going to tell them about why you're not going? And I'm like, why do I have to tell them anything? Why does anyone need to know why I'm not doing something?
No is a full explanation.
Right. But I wasn't raised like that. And for most of my life, I always was like, I can't do that because I have these other, and I'm like, nobody cares. I'm making a bigger deal out of this than anyone else. No, I can't do it. Sorry. Next time. So I think that it's just, it is something that we have to practice in order to get comfortable with it.
Yeah, and it's definitely a muscle. I'm always like worried about everybody else's feelings, and it's like, no one gives a shit. You can either come or you can't. It's fine.
And also at the end of the day, like it doesn't make you nice or not nice to do that, right? It just is.
100%.
Yeah. Last one, a piece of advice you'd want everyone to know.
I think it's important to understand who you are and then be the best version of that person. We all spend so much time trying to fit in to different scenarios and situations that we sometimes get so lost, and then we're not the best version of anything. So no, we're not perfect. Figure out like where do you get your joy? What makes you unhappy? And then try to be the best version of the person that is that. And don't worry about what everyone else thinks. Frankly, they're going to talk about you anyway. So, like there's just really no point worrying about it.
Yeah. Let them. Yeah.
We all have to get inspiration from places. I'm hoping that, as I keep reading this book, that it is very inspiring to remind myself that I have no control over what other people think. I only have control over what I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And how you live your life and how you take your energy, or channel your energy. I think that's such sage advice, is to figure out who you are and be the best version.
Yeah, figure out who you are and then just try to be the best version of that. And that's it. No one's asking for any more than that.
Yeah.
And if
so
they
freeing.
Through them.
Love it. Love it.
Thanks, guys.
This episode was produced, edited, and all things by us, myself, Mel Plutt, and Francesca Ranieri. Our music is by Pink Zebra. And if you loved this conversation and you want to contribute your thoughts with us, please do. You can visit us at yourworkfriends.com, but you can also join us over on LinkedIn. We have a LinkedIn community page. And we have the TikToks and Instagram. So please join us in the socials. And if you like this and you've benefited from this episode and you think someone else can benefit from this episode, please like, rate, and subscribe. We'd really appreciate it. That helps keep us going.
Yeah. All right. Take care, friends.
All right. Bye, friends.
Bye, friends.